So I'm here with Lizzie today to talk about our new briefing with the Mental Health Policy Research Unit, which is all about accessing remote care for our mental health. So hi, Lizzie.
Hiya.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So, hi guys, I'm Lizzie. I'm 26 and I'm a member of the Policy Research Unit's Lived Experience Working Group, which is the longest title ever. But we're basically just a group of people who have lived experience of mental health, and we help out researchers with their research by using our own experiences.
Amazing. So we wanted to chat a little bit today because of this new briefing coming out, and we've both got experience of accessing remote mental health services. So Lizzie, could you just tell us maybe a little bit about your experience of doing that?
Sure. So I've accessed counselling and therapy using internet technology. So I've had counselling through the phone, through FaceTime, and also through using online platforms like moderators, web chats, things like that, and online support groups as well. So that's kind of where my experience is. What about yours?
So I was actually accessing therapy when the pandemic hit. So that was NHS therapy, which had to go online very, very quickly, which was interesting. And then since then, I've been really privileged to access some paid private therapy. And also a massive help to me has been an online support group, which meets kind of fortnightly on WebEx, which is like another digital platform. So yeah, how have you found it on the whole, kind of your experiences, or has it been different or?
I think I was really skeptical to start with. I was kind of like, no, I want to see someone, I want to be face to face. And I really struggled to overcome that barrier. I was kind of like, no, it's going to be rubbish online. I'm not going to get the same out of it. But then I think after the first couple of sessions, I started to enjoy is probably the wrong word, but appreciate it being online more. I was at uni at the time, like at college and uni, and I found it so much easier just being able to come home, like pick up my phone or laptop and just sit in my room and talk to someone rather than having to like get the bus or the train to somewhere across town after college. And I found it a lot more accessible. And I know everyone's different, but I found like I could be more open in my own space. I think because I do it in my room and I was comfortable in my room, that was where I spent a lot of my time. I felt like it was my space and I felt safe in there. So I found myself being able to be more honest with my therapist because it was like they were in my space rather than me being in theirs, if that makes sense. So I think I found it easier in that sense. I do think in some ways I found it harder to build rapport with them because obviously I hadn't met them in person. So there was kind of less time for that like informal chit chat that you might get at the start of a session. And not having that like physical presence, I think was harder in some ways. But equally, I think overall I found it quite positive and I was quite surprised with that.
That's really interesting, the point that you made about feeling more comfortable because it was your space rather than going somewhere else. And that's something I haven't heard before, and that's really interesting. Yeah, I think for me, because it was sort of necessitated by the pandemic and the lockdowns, I was just grateful to have anything really, because we weren't, obviously, it's not hard to remember, but it feels like a while back, but we weren't allowed to leave the house, right, except for exercise. There's no way I could have got on a train and met with someone in person. So I think a lot of us felt that sense of isolation. And so just to be able to at least see my therapist on a screen and chat to her about, kind of pick up where we'd left off was immensely valuable. I think there's always something that you don't get with online support, I'd say, just in terms of, in the same way that, when you have a meeting with someone online like this, it's different to meeting in the flesh. There will always be that. But I guess for me, probably the benefits of being able to access support and, as you say, to not travel, the kind of the flexibility of being able to choose someone even if they didn't live nearby, I think for me that probably outweighs it. And yeah, for me personally, I didn't find it too much of a barrier to to kind of just chat online in the same way I do with someone in person.
Definitely. And I think at the time, I was really struggling with anxiety, and I had so much anxiety about like, what if I have to get the train? Then what if I see someone I know on the train? What if someone sees me going in? What if the train's like, what if I miss my appointment? Like all these different things that would just be like completely going round in my head, causing chaos and making me feel like so anxious. All that was removed. So I think I found the whole like process of having a therapist and finding a therapist a lot easier when you weren't thinking about traveling there and back as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess also, if you're feeling a bit vulnerable after a session, at least you're at home rather than then. Yeah, for me, it was like traveling across the city, and that was always just like a bit of an ordeal after a really challenging session. So you're right. But I thought it was also really interesting what you said there about the fact that you had your own space and your safe space. And I think that's something that came out of our briefing based on the policy research unit's work and research, is that if people have, that's great, but not everyone does have that space. And some people were worried about privacy. And I know still now some people are worried about, might be overheard by other people in the house who don't know they're accessing therapy, or for whom having a physical private space that is really contained is actually really vital. So I guess that's a challenge of like online support.
Definitely. And I think like I'm lucky in that I did have a really supportive family, and they all knew I was home therapy, and they gave me space. Like they wouldn't come upstairs when they knew I was having a session. But then I do know friends who've had the opposite, and they've maybe had to go out, like again when it was the pandemic, they'd like go out for walks or something to talk to their therapist on the phone, which obviously isn't ideal, but they needed to do that in order to have some privacy. So I think it's very dependent as well. And now I've got a friend who will go to a cafe and have her therapy session, and she'll just sit in Costa and buy a drink and talk to a therapist, and that's what works for her. So I think everyone's going to be different, but I definitely think like having a supportive household or having a safe space is like one of the biggest facilitators of telemental health actually working.
Yeah, and I mean it goes without saying, but it needs to be said that obviously, especially when we're talking about video technology, that's just not always accessible to people. And actually people who are digitally excluded don't have that option. So, we're in a privileged position in that respect to have access to a laptop and, headphones and all of the other stuff. But if you don't have that, then this isn't even an option. And I guess that's something else that the briefings pulled out, is like you say, everyone's different. Everyone's got different preferences, but also everyone's got different circumstances. And for some, it might be like super helpful, and it might mean that people who wouldn't have gone to a physical space can actually access support, which is amazing. But I think the fear is if it becomes the only option, then there's loads of people who will be cut off from support.
Definitely. And I think a lot of the time they'll offer telephone counselling to people who can't access video and vice versa. But I think as well it comes with the preference. If someone's got a preference for face to face or for video or for telephone or whatever, I think at the end of the day it should be up to the person as far as possible, because they're like, if you feel like you're listened to and your preferences are being accounted for, you're going to have a better bond with your therapist. You're going to get more out of the support, and ultimately like it's the relationship you have with your therapist that will help the most.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like someone said in the briefing, someone who was sharing like a lived experience commentary said, like if it's not a meaningful choice, if you don't have another option, it's not a choice. If it's just like online therapy or nothing, that's not a choice. And so kind of that flexibility is really necessary, so that people don't feel like they're just being kind of done to or being fobbed off. And also we know that like it's not the cheap option. Like I think sometimes people can think it's cheaper because you don't have to have a physical space, but actually it needs a lot of investment, especially to make sure that everyone can access it. But yeah, I mean, like, what would you say you've encountered as like the main kind of pros and cons of seeking out like remote technology care?
So I think similar to you, I did pay privately to have some counselling at one point. And I think for me, the main advantage of then doing it remotely was having a wider pool of therapists that I could choose from, because I struggled with an eating disorder and I wanted a specialist. it just opened up like the whole country, right? Well, the whole world in some respects, because you can have a Zoom or FaceTime from anywhere. So I think increasing the amount of people, kind of like I mentioned, the accessibility, it removed like the anxiety barrier, and having it in like my own safe space, I think really helped. So those would be the main advantages. I think the main disadvantages were probably, although like I said, I did have a supportive family, sometimes I did feel conscious of like, are they going to overhear, are they going to listen to what I'm saying, are they going to know, that kind of thing. I think having my own space afterwards, like you can use, although the travel time I've just moaned about, sometimes it's quite good for like decompression, because you have like space between what you've talked about and then being at home, and you can kind of rest, whereas when you're just having it in your room, you can't really do that. So I think that was a bit of a problem. I think like dodgy internet sometimes is really annoying, like days when like my brothers were gaming or something and the Wi-Fi kept falling over and I kept having to like redial like 5 times. That was really annoying. So I think those were the main barriers for me. Oh, and I guess it did take slightly longer to build rapport with my therapist because I didn't really know them. And it felt like it's different when you're like talking to someone staring at a screen compared to when they're sat in front of you. So I feel like the whole like body language and like cues and things were a bit lost sometimes. We did get there in the end, but I think it just took longer than it would have done face to face. So I think those would be my mind. But what about yours?
Yeah, and I think kind of based on that, I sort of wonder how I would have found it if I'd never accessed like therapy in person before, because I'm quite open talking about what's going on in my mind, and I'm sort of used to that setting where it's like they ask me something and I would talk about X, Y, and Z. But I think maybe if I was new to that whole idea of like, you know, talking therapies, that might have been a much harder transition to just like, oh, there's a person on a screen and I'm just going to tell you all of my deepest, darkest fears. You know, like that's quite tricky. And I guess also maybe there's an element as well of for people who are like working online and doing meetings online, it feels quite like it could feel quite like work.
Yeah.
You know, you might be using the same programs that you use for work. And so there's a much harder distinction there, isn't there, between like, you know, your work life, your professional life, and your kind of personal and your mental health. But I think for me, as I've said, you know, access when it was the only option was a massive advantage. And actually, since the pandemic, I've moved, and that's meant that during that move, I've still been able to carry on with the online support group I was accessing because it went online and still is online for people who find that easier. It means that there was this consistency at a time of like massive upheaval, pandemic, like my mental health wasn't great. And there was like a consistent group of people. I didn't have to pick up and start again. So the consistency that that's afforded me, I think, has been really massive. And I would say like a massive shout out to support groups because I think they're fantastic and can be really helpful. But yeah, I've really appreciated with that, and that just couldn't have happened in person. And being able to speak to people sort of all over the country who've got similar experiences to me and really get it has been, you know, invaluable. And yeah, doing that online whilst I'm eating my dinner, having just finished work, is amazing. But yeah, so I guess like we've talked quite a lot about like the pros and cons and obviously flagged up some really obvious issues with it, like digital exclusion. But I mean, what, you know, going forward, we are allowed to meet in person. What do you think the future should look like for remote care?
I think kind of like I said, choice. I think choice is everything. I think sometimes what can be helpful, and I know a couple of like therapists who do this, is they'll offer like trials of each. So maybe you could have your first session in person, then you could try it online and vice versa and see which one you prefer. And I think that can be really helpful because a lot of people might really think they might really like in person and then they don't, and vice versa. So I think choice is everything, and then allowing people to kind of go with whatever their choice is and make that work for them. I'm sure like most therapists do have a preference of either online or in person, but at the end of the day, it's about the person that you're helping. And so kind of allowing them to guide and lead it, I think is super important. And I think making sure that, like you said about platforms, making sure they're confidential, making sure that the communication's good. So whether you arrange appointments by email or by text or phone call or whatever it is, making sure that the communication's always open and that the option's always there. So say you meet face to face, but one day you're ill or you're having a bad day, then there's the option to do it online if you want to. So yeah, I think for me the future is just choice and communication, really. What about you?
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree, and I don't think I could say it better, to be honest. I think, yeah, I think remote care really has opened up lots of opportunities for lots of people, but it's also posed massive barriers to some. And focusing on equality and mental health, we can't just say that one size fits all and everyone needs to get with the program digitally, because that's not the case, and that would really risk kind of cutting people off who really need support. And we don't want to exacerbate already existing inequalities that are all tied up with digital exclusion and digital poverty and relative poverty and absolute poverty and all of these things going on. We want to make it as accessible as possible. So I think for me, it's investing in what's there and making it as equitable and accessible, and giving people a choice whether they want to meet face to face or online. I think that would be amazing. Thanks so much for chatting with me today, Lizzie. It's been really great to catch up.
No worries. It's been great to chat with you.